Yesterday, my brother and I had one of those conversations that probably happened in thousands of homes across Canada this week. It started with Ukraine, and 2 minutes later, we were talking about temporary foreign workers. And by the time we were done, I realized we weren't really talking about what we thought we were talking about. In today's episode, we're going to walk through that conversation because I have a feeling that by the end of it, you're going to be feeling a lot like my brother and I did.
From the headlines to what's really going on underneath. This is The Canadianist. Real conversations about Canada. What's happening, why it matters, and where it's all heading. Here's Chris.
Hello, friends, fellow Canadians. My name is Christopher M. Michaud. This is The Canadianist. Welcome to the podcast. So yesterday, my brother and I got into a discussion about Ukraine. And actually, it began the way a lot of discussions about Canada start these days. He looked at me and said, and I'm quoting him exactly here because I want you to hear the frustration in my brother's voice. I think there are millions of Canadians who feel exactly the same way he does right now. His exact words to me were, why the fuck are we giving almost $1 billion to Ukraine when people here are struggling to buy groceries? So I started giving him the answers I thought made sense. I explained it wasn't as simple as writing a check, that a lot of the money stays here in Canada and Canadian companies manufacture the equipment, Canadian workers build it, and then jobs are created because of it. And as I started explaining all of the reasons why I thought it made a little sense, he cut me off. I don't give a shit. I don't care. It could be Ukraine. It could be the Congo. It could be anywhere. I don't care where the money's going. Why are we sending almost $1 billion somewhere else when people here are struggling just to eat? And that's the moment I realized he really wasn't talking to me about Ukraine. He was asking me something bigger. So I spent the day digging into it. And what I found is that the headline doesn't tell the whole story. When we hear that Canada is sending another $900 million to Ukraine, most people picture a giant check flying from Ottawa and landing in Kyiv. And that's not really what's happening. A significant portion of the package is procurement. Canada buys ammunition, military equipment, and vehicles, much of it from Canadian manufacturers. And those contracts support Canadian companies and Canadian workers. But here's the part that still didn't answer my brother's question, because from his perspective, and from the perspective of millions of Canadians, the issue isn't whether a Canadian factory benefits from a contract. The issue is that groceries are still expensive, housing is still expensive, and we pay a lot of tax. And young people, they're struggling to find work, while families are wondering how they're going to get ahead. So when the headline they see is another $1 billion going overseas, it lands very differently than it may have 5 or 10 years ago. And before anyone misunderstands me, let me be clear. Canada has legitimate reasons to support Ukraine. Russia invaded a sovereign country, and Canada has treaty obligations and strategic interests. These are good arguments for helping an ally under attack. That's not really the debate my brother was having with me. His point wasn't that Canada should never help Ukraine. His point was much simpler. Why does it feel like we're hearing about another $1 billion for Ukraine before people here at home feel like life is getting any easier? Governments don't govern in a vacuum, and people judge priorities by what they see. If Canadians feel like their own problems aren't improving, every announcement about money leaving the country feels bigger than it actually is. And that's not necessarily because the policy is wrong. It's because the public has stopped feeling like they're at the front of the line. And I think that's where governments get themselves into trouble. Instead of announcing another foreign aid package first, imagine if Canadians had spent the previous month watching their government roll out meaningful action on housing, affordability, small business investment, and job creation. Imagine if people could actually point to something tangible in their own lives and say, yeah, things are finally moving. That exact same Ukraine announcement would have landed probably very differently. People aren't just reacting to the amount. They're reacting to what it believes it says about priorities. And I think that's where this becomes much bigger than Ukraine. Then my brother came at me with another gripe, and honestly, I think it's one a lot of Canadians share. From there, the conversation led my brother to shift gears and start talking about temporary foreign workers. And by the time we'd finished that conversation, I realized we weren't really talking about Ukraine anymore. We were talking about something much deeper. We were talking about whether Canadians still believe their government is putting Canadians first. So before the break, I was telling you about a conversation my brother and I had that started with Ukraine. But the conversation didn't end there. From there, my brother shifted gears and started talking about temporary foreign workers. And honestly, I found that that part of the conversation was even tougher because underneath all the headlines and all of the politics was a question that I think a lot of Canadians are asking right now. He said, if Canadians are struggling to find entry-level jobs, why are we still bringing temporary foreign workers? And before anybody jumps to conclusions, it's not a question about race or where someone came from. It's a question of priorities. When people look around today, they see something very different than they remembered 20 years ago. They walk into a coffee shop, a gas station, or a convenience store, and they notice who's working there. Then they look at their own son or daughter who's been handing out resumes for weeks, or how they drive past another encampment and wonder how many of those people, if given the opportunity, could actually be working. That doesn't automatically mean the system is broken, but it does raise a perfectly reasonable question. Have we done everything we reasonably can to connect the people who are already here with those jobs before expanding temporary labor programs? Before we answer that, let's do what we did in the first segment and look at the facts. As of June 2026, Canada's national unemployment rate sits at 6.5%. That's an improvement from earlier this year, but it still represents well over 1 million Canadians looking for work. The picture changes even more when you look at younger Canadians. The unemployment rate for Canadians between the ages of 15 and 24 is 12.7%, almost double the national average. For students looking for summer work, it's even higher. Returning full-time students face an unemployment rate of 15.3 in June, and full-time students overall were at 15.6%. At the same time, Canada continues to have a very large temporary resident population. The federal government has acknowledged that temporary residents have placed pressure on housing, infrastructure, and public services, and is committed to reducing the temporary population to below 5% of Canada's total population. The government has also tightened the intake of temporary foreign workers and international students over the past year. Some permits will expire, some people will leave Canada, and others will transition to permanent residence. In other words, the number of temporary residents isn't fixed, but it's already beginning to change as the government adjusts immigration policy. Now, here's the important part. Canada still has genuine labor shortages. Agriculture is one example. Certain seasonal jobs, remote communities, and specialized occupations continue to struggle to attract enough workers, even when employers recruit domestically. Temporary foreign workers continue to play an important role in those sectors. So the facts don't support two extreme positions. They don't support the idea that temporary foreign workers are not needed at all. But they also don't answer the question my brother was talking about. If youth unemployment still sits at nearly 13%, and if students are struggling to find their first job, and if there are Canadians trying to get back into the workforce, how does the government demonstrate that it has made every reasonable effort to connect those Canadians with available entry-level work before expanding temporary labor programs? That's not a question about race or origins. It's not even really a question about immigration. It's a question of priorities. Okay. So what do the facts tell us? To me, they tell us something important. Temporary foreign workers absolutely have a place in Canada's economy. There are industries that genuinely struggle to find enough workers, and agriculture is an obvious example. There are others too. The problem is that Canadians need to believe that we've worked through the people who are already here first. Young people trying to get their first job, someone who's been laid off and is trying to get back into the workforce, someone who's finally trying to rebuild their life after a difficult period. Those people deserve to know that the government has made every reasonable effort to connect them with available work before deciding the answer is to bring in more temporary labor. That is the issue. It's not whether temporary foreign workers should exist. It's whether Canadians are confident that the program is being used the way it was originally intended, to fill genuine labor shortages. not as the first option before we've exhausted the workforce that's already here. Because once people lose confidence in that, the conversation stops being about labor policy. It becomes a conversation about trust. And that's exactly where my brother's question led me. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Christopher M. Michaud. This is The Canadianist. This is the last segment of the show today. I've been thinking about those two issues my brother and I were speaking about, and I think I finally figured out why they bothered me so much. At first, I thought they were two completely different conversations. One was about Ukraine, and the other was about temporary foreign workers. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized they were actually asking the same question. How do Canadians know their government is putting them first? And not first because we shouldn't help our allies or welcome newcomers. First, because that's the government's job. Think about what we've talked about today. With Ukraine, I don't think most Canadians are arguing that Ukraine doesn't deserve our support. What they're asking is why we're hearing about another $1 billion going overseas when they still can't afford groceries, when housing is still out of reach for so many families, and when they feel like not much has changed in their own lives. Then we moved on to temporary foreign workers. And again, I don't think most Canadians are saying we should never have temporary foreign workers. We have industries that genuinely need them, and we talked about that. What they're asking is something completely different. What Canadians are really asking is whether we've done everything we reasonably can before. And I say before we decide the answer is bringing in more temporary foreign workers. Have we made every effort to help a young Canadian find that first job? Have we made every effort to help someone who's been laid off get back into the workforce? I don't think there'd be nearly as much opposition to temporary foreign workers filling the jobs that genuinely can't be filled any other way. And if the answer is yes, I think Canadians are much more willing to support helping Ukraine too. Instead, people compare those announcements to what's happening in their own lives. They hear another announcement about Ukraine or another discussion about temporary foreign workers, and they naturally ask, okay, well, what about us? And I don't think that's selfish. I think it's human. If you're worried about paying rent, if you're standing in the grocery store trying to decide what you have to put back because you can't afford everything in your cart, or if you've ever opened your wallet because you heard a few coins jingling around and you had to count to see if there was enough money for a loaf of bread or a quart of milk, you're going to look at that government announcement through that lens. Here's another one. If you've ever had to make a meal out of a hot dog bun and free relish packets from a convenience store because that's all you had, you're going to hear a $1 billion announcement very differently than someone who spent their career reading briefing notes and economic reports. That's where I think the government gets this wrong. They assume that people are judging one announcement at a time, when in reality, they're judging whether they feel their own lives are moving in the right direction. That's where the United Canadian Centrist Party would govern differently. We wouldn't stop helping Ukraine, and we wouldn't eliminate temporary foreign workers before they're genuinely needed. But before we ask Canadians to support those decisions, we'd make sure that they could already see and feel that their government is fighting just as hard to make life better here at home for them. That's the backdrop we'd create before making those announcements. When Canadians see the progress in their own communities and when they can feel that the government has made them first as priority, those other conversations become much easier to have. Looking back, I don't think my brother and I were really arguing about Ukraine or immigration at all. We were talking about trust and whether Canadians still believe their government understands what life actually feels like for the people it's supposed to be serving. And I think that's the lesson I took away from all of this. It earns people's confidence by demonstrating that it's fighting just as hard for the people who are already here as it is for every other priority on their agenda. You know, it's funny. I was thinking about this today and I realized I'd already written about this in my book, Canadianism. I didn't even connect it to this conversation. One of the central ideas in that book is that results matter more than intentions. Governments can have the best intentions in the world, but people don't live in intentions. They live in results. They judge governments by what they can actually see and feel in their own lives. Once Canadians can see that in their own lives, once they can actually feel that things are moving in the right direction, I think they're far more willing to support helping our allies abroad or bringing in temporary workers where they're genuinely needed. That's why, for me, this was never really an argument about Ukraine or immigration. It was an argument about what it means to put Canadians first, not in the sense that we stop caring about the rest of the world, in the sense that before we ask Canadians to carry another burden, we demonstrate that we've done everything reasonably possible to lighten the burdens they're already carrying. To me, that's what responsible government looks like. And I think that's the standard Canadians should expect from every government, regardless of the party. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to The Canadianist. New episodes daily. Real conversations about Canada. What's happening, why it matters, and where it's all heading. Subscribe and stay connected. The Canadianist.